When we left off, we were talking about Get Smart. I'd like to talk about some of the people that you worked with, one being Barbara Feldman.
Yeah. Barbara had, at the time we cast her, was doing a commercial for a perfume, Hey Tiger or something, and she was a model and very beautiful. And it was a very successful commercial. And we cast her, and we did the pilot, and the show was going into production. And about 2 days before we started production, we got a phone call from the advertising agency who was working for whoever bought the show, and I don't remember who it was who bought the show, but they had a perfume, and they were saying we had to replace Barbara. And we said, we can't replace her. Well, you have to. The sponsor doesn't feel comfortable with her in it. So while they were shooting on the stage, we were interviewing, seeing other ladies, and it was just a terrible feeling because we just knew how good she was, and she's such a terrific lady. And what happened is she flew back, and she got Revlon to promise they wouldn't run the commercials anymore. And she flew back and talked to the owner of the company, whoever it was, and convinced him that they wouldn't run the competing commercials and she should be on the show. But it was really a terrible thought. And we just hated having to be interviewing other people while the show was shooting. It was like the third or fourth week of shooting. And she is an extremely bright person. And there was always a lot of, I wouldn't say controversy, but there was always a lot of things happening when Don was around, because some days he loved everything and other days he didn't like things and he sort of wanted to do things his way. And Barbara always just stayed above the fray. I just always remember coming in the morning when she was in makeup reading the stock pages. That always amazed me in those days for a woman to be so involved in stocks. And I don't think she had a lot invested, but she was very smart. She's just a lovely, lovely person. And Ed Platt was terrific. So, I mean, it was a nice group of people.
And what about Buck Henry's contribution to the show?
He's amazing. Buck would sort of put off writing or doing rewrites till the last minute, because that's just the way he worked. And then he'd go into his room and start. I'd give notes. I did a series called Captain Nice with Buck after Get Smart, and I would just give notes. I didn't think this joke works or this scene isn't right or blah, blah, blah. And he would just come out of his office and hand you pages, and it would be so wonderful. And Get Smart, as I said, Leonard would work on the story, and maybe one of the other teams of writers would write a first draft, but those really funny, wonderful, adult, sophisticated, interesting lines usually were Buck's. He's just an amazing writer. And Mel Brooks gets all the credit because I'm sure a lot of the zaniness and craziness of the pilot came from Mel's mind, but Buck still is. I haven't read anything he's written lately, but you don't lose that sharp wit. And we never could have done it without him.
Now, this one, was this the first color television show you've done?
Interesting question. As you can tell, I have no idea. Was it color? Get Smart was not black and white when we started? I don't know. I remember Van Dyke going, or talking about, they talked about Van Dyke going to color. Nobody'd watch it in black and white, but I don't think they did. But to be honest with you, it's an interesting question. I have no idea.
Did the transition from black and white to color have any effect on what you did?
No, not as far as directing. For a long while, it meant hotter lights on the audience shows. Bigger lights and hotter, and then eventually cameramen started bouncing lights and using different ways, so it wasn't so bad, but we didn't shoot any differently. It's not like the widescreen ratio that now you have to sometimes worry about shooting off of sets. But, color was not a problem.
Also, we ask all of our interviewees about the blacklist and if that affected them at all. Do you have any?
No, I was too young for the real blacklist. I remember it, of course, and I've worked with a few actors. One I remember really well was I did a movie for television with Lee Grant, and I don't know, we just vaguely talked about it. I mean, she's such an immensely talented woman, and you wonder what wonderful role she would have portrayed in the years that she couldn't work. And then on the Danny Thomas show, we worked with a story editor. He was a wonderful writer, a man named Frank Tarloff. And he used David Adler as his pen name. Now, this was long after the blacklist, but it still had affected him. And I think he'd gone to England to work. So, I mean, there was, still remnants of people whose careers had been really badly hurt. But I was a little young for that. Lucy, as I remembered, I don't remember the whole story, but I think Lucy's grandfather was either had signed up with the Communist Party or some sympathizer or something, and she, to please him, had registered or something as a communist. I don't remember the story. She wasn't, of course. She was not a political person, but it came out one Wednesday. I think we filmed on Thursday in those days, and it came on the papers on the Thursday that she was a communist, which of course she wasn't, but it was a big thing, and they were really worried about what was going to happen to the show. And I remember the Thursday night, Desi came out and gave a little speech about Lucy and why she'd done it. And of course, she was a good American and not a communist and was not political, and she'd done it for her grandfather. And nobody quite knew how the audience would react. And she came out, and of course, they stood up and gave her a standing ovation. But she had, I don't really remember, but I know that there was some problem with that. And they were afraid that the sponsors would pull out of the shows. Of course, they didn't, because it was the #1 show, but that was a worry.
Let's move on. In 1970, you began...
Oh, we're only up to 1970?
you began serving as the primary director on the Mary Tyler Moore Show.
Right.
How did that come about for you?
Luckiest thing in my career. Another wonderful director was offered the show. He had worked with Mary before. He was offered the show, and I'm not sure of the reason, but they couldn't come to some financial terms, whatever the problem was. And I had worked on the pilot of the Dick Van Dyke Show. I had worked as assistant director on a film Mary was on called X-15, and they had, Grant and Mary had seen He and She, and both had liked it. So to the best of my knowledge, that after this other director turned the show down, they came to me. I don't know, they may not have. They came to me 7th or 8th, but it didn't much matter. And at that point in my career, I had done He and She and a few other shows, but I really wasn't doing anything great, anything I was proud of. And Grant called me up and said, we'd like to meet with you. And Mary and I reminisced about the pilot and everything, and they gave me a script or an outline. Maybe they just gave me an outline. I don't think the script had been written yet. And I read it, and I didn't know Jim Brooks and Alan Burns at that point. And I said, whoa, this is really going to be good. So, yeah, I'd love to do that. But I said, for your sake and my sake, I don't want to do all of them. I'll do the first couple, and then you bring in another couple of directors. And I never did more than 2/3 of the show. I always did, out of 24 shows, I always did like 16, because I like to go out and do other shows, and I also felt it would be good to get another point of view. I think I was doing some other shows at the time, so maybe that's why I said it. It sounds very altruistic the way I'm saying it. There must have been something else. But I think I did the first 3 shows. Then Al Rafkin came in and wrote his Mother show. And I think another director came in, then I came back. And all I remember was what a thrill it was to come back. And I told Grant, at the best of my knowledge, I said, let's try these first 3 shows and see how it works out. But the second, I had a chance and said to Grant, no, I'd really love to come back.
Now, initially, how was the show described to you?
Well, initially, the concept was she was a divorced woman. And Jim and Alan Grant took it back to CBS in New York. Mike Dan, who was head of program, said, absolutely not. You cannot have a divorced woman. It's a single divorced woman going on her own, having to make a living. And so what they did, which is so silly, she'd been living with this guy for 4 years, putting him through college. And then when he graduated, it was, well, let's get married. And he said, yeah, let's talk about it. So that's when she left and moved to Minneapolis. So it was okay to be living with somebody, but it wasn't okay to be divorced in those days. And I was around for casting because what had happened was Mary had done a live variety show with Dick Van Dyke. Dick had, I guess, a series of variety shows. And it gotten such high ratings that the audience said, well, gee, maybe Mary Tyler Moore had something to do with it. So they gave her and Grant a pickup for 13 shows. No premise, just do a show with Mary. And Grant, who I'm sure Grant has told you this story, but he was working at 20th Century Fox then. And Jim Brooks was doing Room 222. And Alan had come in when Jim was gone to work on some of the scripts. And Grant put the two of them together. He just felt they'd be a good team. They'd never worked together. And he felt with their sensibilities, they'd be a good team. And so he hired Jim and Alan to come up with the idea. So I wasn't there for the very beginning, but I was there back and forth because I was also doing at the time Bill Cosby's first show where he was a school teacher in high school. And so I'd be there for most of the casting. I was there for Valerie's casting, and I was there for Gavin's casting and Cloris's. I wasn't there for Ed's or Ted Knight. And now I don't remember the original question. Casting at the show? Was that what we were talking about?
We were talking about how the show was described to you initially.
Well, I mean, it was basically an interesting story, and maybe my perspective is wrong. So, I mean, other people have different perspectives, but it was right at the beginning of the women's movement, of how women were starting to go out in the workplace and starting to try to be independent. But that was never the concept of the show. It was supposed to be a show about a newsroom and Mary and the single woman and being on her own and working in a man's world. What happened is, as the women's movement got stronger and stronger, Valerie Harper, who was really attuned to it, would say to Mary, you can't say those lines. You can't do that. She's not just a secretary, blah, blah, blah. And Mary would say to the guys, I can't say these lines because of so-and-so, And gradually the show evolved. And Jim and Alan, I don't think, were particularly attuned to the women's movement, although there were women writers on the staff. I don't mean they were not adverse to it. They just, like most guys, just weren't aware of what was going on. And so it was Valerie who sort of started this whole thing about more and more being a single working woman who is not just on her own, but has a point of view about things. It's very interesting. It never started out to be something that it turned into. And it hit at just the right time and a perfect time for that show.
Now, how was the tone and the style of that show set?
Well, the tone was set in the writing. The style, obviously the director had a part of it. I mean, I have to feel that I helped affect the style of the show. There were really, it was interesting, there were two schools of comedy that were very successful at that time. And Norman Lear did his shows like a stage play, facing more out to the audience and projecting a lot more. I always felt that when you're watching on television, you wonder, why are people yelling at each other? Why aren't they just talking? So I tried to do more of a word play and play to each other and talk to each other and not scream the lines, Because I would always say, well, we've got mics and we're in close-up, you don't have to yell. Because there was an audience of 300 people. And an actor's natural tendency is for everybody to hear, especially theater people. I mean, Ed Asner had a big booming voice, and I used to constantly have to talk to him about, you don't have to yell, pull it down. They can hear you because they're mics. So the style I think I brought to it was more of a conversational style, although it's still, there's a lot of projection in it. It was less for those days than other shows. And I didn't have people play out front. I had them play more to each other, and I tried to keep a lot of movement and try to find the reality. I mean, the writing was so good, and it was so real. If historians will look at the beginning shows with Ted Baxter, Ted Knight, and he was so dumb and so unreal. And as the series went on more and more and more, he started finding his humanity, and we started finding it. And although he was still a conceited character and he wasn't too bright, more and more of the real human being came out, which didn't start. Originally, he was just sort of one of those dumb, good-looking guys. And originally, there was supposed to be maybe a romance between Mary and Ted's character. In the pilot, I think he only has 2 or 3 lines. But as the series started going on, we knew that wasn't going to work. But it was a really wonderfully written show. It was so interesting and intelligent, and the laughs would come out of character. And there really wasn't anything like it at the time. It was just wonderful writing, well acted. So, obviously a style has to depend on the director. Jim Brooks and I had different opinions, very different opinions on how things should play. And for 8 years, we battled. And thank God for Alan Burns, who would sort of be caught in the middle and mediating. But about the 4th show, Mary called Jim and me into her trailer and said, you guys have to work this out. I can't stand it, because we were in constant battle. I didn't want things to be quite so big and broad. And I think at that point, Jim wanted things to play a little bigger. And I'm not being critical, but I'm saying the truth. There was a constant battle between me and Jim, who I think is brilliant. And somehow we'd find a third way to play things and do things. But we started off, it was quite loud, this side of the camera. And Mary really said, I just can't stand this. You guys have to work this out. So somehow we found a way not to yell and scream. We still have our arguments.
How active of a role behind the scenes did Mary play in all of this?
Very little. Very little. What we did was, because we had the time, and I always felt it was wonderful for writers to hear their lines said in front of an audience. We were filming on a Friday, and Tuesday we did a run-through with an audience. And we didn't film it, but it was a run-through for an audience. And it turned out that the cast wasn't quite ready yet, because they just weren't there. And it was a disaster run-through. I mean, I don't think we got 6 laughs in the whole show. And it was a really depressing evening. I mean, it was just like, here we thought we were doing such a good show, and it was so well written. And the audience just weren't laughing at it. And so I remember we went into the writer-producer's office, and Jim and Alan and me and Grant, I don't even think Mary was there, and Marge Mullen, who was our script supervisor. And so we were talking, what's the matter? And Marge came up with the idea that, well, the audience didn't like Valerie. They just didn't like her, because in the opening pilot, she's fighting Mary. She wants that apartment. She lives upstairs, and that's my apartment, get out. And so Marge said, well, what if the little girl, Phyllis's daughter, says, oh, that's just Aunt Rhoda, she's really great. Maybe the audience will like her. And that's, I think, one of the only rewrites that was in the script, just that. And we all sat around, and I know that Jim and Alan, long after I left, stayed there, and none of us could figure out what to do, because we all thought it was good. And so I remember going the next day to rehearsal, because now this is Wednesday, cameras come in on Thursday. So we had a whole day to do any rewrites, and there were very few. And I remember just talking to the cast and saying, you know, basically we still trust this. Let's just rehearse. There, you know, you can see there are maybe 4 or 5 line changes in the whole script, and let's just do it. And somehow we got through that day and camera day, and we did the show, and the performances were different. I mean, they just were sharper. And Ed, I remember when he said, "You got spunk, I hate spunk," did it so loud that you could hear the audience go, and he found the perfect level. And Valerie, they liked Valerie, and it was just a great evening. But to the best of my knowledge, at that point, we thought, boy, Grant and Mary are great. No, you know, they weren't upset. Mary didn't come in hysterical. I found out many years later that Grant had called up Jim and Alan and said, do something. Mary wants you to do something. There was nothing to do. It was a good script and it was a good show. It's just we weren't quite ready. But it was a bad evening. I felt like, because those days with 3-camera film shows, you weren't in a booth, you were on the floor. And you're facing the cast and the audience is at your back. And I literally thought, somebody's going to throw a knife out of the stand and get me. They hate this show so much.
But that was at that run-through.
Yeah, no, the night of the show. And I mean, it just, there've been 2 really amazing evenings for me. One was that, and one was the Cosby presentation, where everything that was said just got monstrous laughs, and you could just feel the audience loving these people. So, but it was a bad evening. But so that, I mean, and then the show evolved. We were so lucky to find Valerie. We had seen practically every actress in town. And Ethel Wynand, who was head of casting for CBS, and also she loved the script so much, was casting the show, had gone to the Mark Taper Theater and seen a stage production called Story Theater. And one of the actresses was Valerie Harper. So Valerie was new to television. And she came in and read for us without Mary. And the character was based upon somebody that Jim had worked with, who was not a particularly attractive woman and was overweight, but had a great sense of humor. And so Valerie was, you know, maybe, I don't know in those days, maybe 10, 15 pounds overweight, but beautiful woman. And she left, and Jim says, you know, in effect, it's a shame because she's really good, but she's not this part. And I said, I think we've got to. I mean, this is just an amazing talent. Let's at least put her together with Mary. So Mary came in, and I called Ethel, and I said, when you tell Val to come back, tell her to dress dowdy and don't wear a lot of makeup. And she came back, and of course, the 2 of them, you just, right off, they just had such a great rapport. But if we hadn't seen practically every actress in town, who knows whether Valerie would have gotten it.
Can you talk about the relationship between the Mary Richards character and Rhoda Morgenstern character?
What do you mean, the relationship?
What kind of relationship did you try to maintain between the 2 of them?
Well, I mean, it was always there in the writing. Mary was the, you know, always, as Valerie once said, I bet you were a cheerleader, weren't you? And dated the captain of the football team. And Mary said, oh, captain of the baseball team. But Mary was always squeaky clean and beautiful, and everybody loved her. And Rhoda's character, although that's not her, was very insecure about herself and her looks and the guy she dated and her intelligence and everything about her. So she always envied Mary, yet Mary envied Rhoda's joie de vivre and her ability to get things accomplished. And Mary's character was, you know, a perfectionist, so things came hard for her. But they basically just adored each other. I mean, Rhoda was Jewish and Mary was waspy, but there was so much love between the 2 characters, the 2 female characters. Plus Mary and Valerie just hit it off. And I mean, the guys who created these real characters, and in writing, they always maintained it. So the hard one to work in was Phyllis, because a lot of times she didn't have any major plot points in a scene. She was there to have her few jokes, and Cloris, as an actress, always wanted every scene to be about Phyllis. and sometimes they just weren't. So that was rehearsals. Sometimes we had to try to find a level so everybody was happy. And Valerie, as an actress, since she had come from story theater, which was essentially what they did, is they took fairy tales. I can't remember which fairy tales, but with animals and things. And the story theater, they took these fairy tales and did them through music, dance, and acting, told the stories. So Valerie came from an improv place, and a place where she was involved with a lot of props. She always had to have props. So our rehearsals, essentially, Mary would pick up the script, and she has a photographic mind, and she knew from the first moment she read the script how she'd play it. So we'd start rehearsal, and Mary knew exactly what she was doing. Valerie had to know where everything was, and she'd learn her lines, but you never really saw a performance till the show. And Cloris would approach it, so why am I here? What is this scene about? How is this scene about me? So for the first 4 or 5 weeks, it was a little difficult to direct sometimes, just to get the scenes going and to find out what was there. But once we really started getting on the air and people relaxing, because I think we did like 5 or 6 shows before it was ever on the air. And everybody's nervous. Once it got on the air and people saw it, and we relaxed more, it became, and we started trusting in each other. Actors don't trust writers and the directors until they know it's working. And conversely, sometimes the writers don't always trust the actors, especially since they never really saw what Valerie was going to do till she did it on the night of the show. So there was a little tension the first 5 or 6 weeks, but nothing. The worst tension was between me and Jim, how to approach scenes.
Now, did you work on the main titles of the show?
No. Dave Davis, who was the associate producer, and a man named Reza Badi, who had done the titles for That Girl. And I think they were sort of the same style of titles. And they went back to Minneapolis and did titles. I had nothing to do with that.
And the theme song?
No. Patrick Williams wrote that.
How about the sets? What was your role in the sets?
It was, any director, art director, how to, can I get the camera up there? Is that wall going to be a swinging wall? And how do I shoot through here? And, just normal. We had a wonderful art director named Kenny Reed. And, it's just what a director does. You try to look at it, well, how am I going to shoot it? But I didn't really have, and I never got involved with the wardrobe or the hair, because I'm the worst person to talk to about women's clothes, or men's clothes for that matter. They didn't even talk to me. I'd say, no, I don't talk to, Alan, who I think was really the maven on, he really knew styles, and we had a very good costume designer, because they wanted Mary to look really chic, and, so wardrobe, I didn't worry about.
Let's stop here to change the tape.
Okay.